Hello and welcome to another Leica review. Today we are discussing zone photography second section, and in this tutorial I'm going to explain how the important factors affecting zone photography or zone metering system is used in practical applications. And for that I'm going to use this application from iPad. You can have various applications on your smartphone or your Android device, and they basically tell you what your focus distance is and the focal length you may choose with it and the aperture settings and how that affects it. Now we are going to do this. We are going to take each step one at a time. First of all, we're going to set our focal length at 50 meters. So we're going to presume that we are using 50 millimeters as our focal length, and that is going to remain consistent. Now we're going to play with this number later on to see how that affects it. And then we're going to set the aperture at, let's take a number like f8, which is commonly used in street photography or photography where we want things to be in focus. So what we are going to do is we're going to play with only one of the determinants of what the focus system is going to use, and which is the subject that is standing away from the camera. So you are behind the camera and the subject matter that is in front of the camera is placed at 7 meters, as you can see at the lower bottom of here. And we can see that there is a depth of near focus, which means the distance in front of the subject, which is at 4 meters. So you are going to get anything that is standing between 4 meters to 7 meters in front of it to be in focus. And behind the subject, starting from 7 meters all the way up to 24.8 meters in total, is going to be in focus. So you got almost what we call about 13 meters behind the subject that is in focus. So in total, depth of focus 20.8 meters. So you are getting a space of over 20 meters that is in focus, and that is using f8. Now watch what happens if I shift this person that's standing at 7 meters further away, and we're going to go up to 10 meters, and notice what happened. The infinity moved all the way to the end, so that means you're going to get anything behind the subject matter to be in focus. So if you're shooting f8 and 50 millimeters and subject matter is 7 meters or 10 meters away from you, then you're going to get everything behind that person or that subject matter in focus. On the front side, you're getting 4.9 meters. Now, that means anything from 4.9 meters all the way back is in focus. Anything in front of that 4.9 meters is going to be out of focus. So that is something very important to consider. So this is what happens when street photography applications use this type of metering system. What happens is they take and put their f-stop at f8 or f11 and get everything in focus. And what that creates is this very iPhone look or smartphone look, which is everything in focus. And that is something that is often not desirable because it does not eliminate the subject matter from the rest of the background. And sometimes we want to include the background, especially in the cases of, for example, if doing landscape photography or architectural photography, because that helps us to tell the story of what the whole thing is. And our subject matter in landscape is pretty much everything that is what we see in front of our eyes. And that means that if we are going to take, for example, a very nice scenic, we want to make sure the ones in the corners is just as sharp as the things that are in the center, because that is a pleasing sight to look at. Now, when we are doing street photography or using zone photography, we must be fully aware of this and make sure that if we are going to use zone photography, that we know exactly what our subject matter is going to look like in the frame. And that will also be determined by the focal length that you use, and also by the camera settings that you apply, which means in this case would be aperture. The aperture that we are applying is f8, and 50 millimeters, although it is a medium length, focal length, is giving us everything in focus. So it's not always necessary to use wider angle lenses. Now, most of the times they use wider angle lenses like the 28 and 35 millimeters in the hopes that they don't fail to capture images that are in the frame. So what they do is they try to get everything in focus. And what that creates is they say, oh, it is street photography. No, it is not street photography. It's just like using a camera with no failure possibilities. It is the cheap way or tricky way of attempting to capture photographs. Because what you're doing is you're saying to the camera, get me everything in focus. I don't care what it is, as long as everything is in focus. And this creates this problem of not identifying the subject matter. And it is this mistake that is often repeated time and time again in the hopes that somehow their images will look better. Now, I will not go into too much detail about that part of it, but what I will continue to do is move the subject matter very close. So what I'm going to do is take the subject matter and move it all the way to 2 meters. And look what happened. The 2 meter, which is usually the distance we want to be photographing with a 50 millimeter because you want to get a kind of a portraiture type of look, it gives us only 40 centimeters in front of the subject matter to be in focus. So you're going to get 1.6 meters, which is indicated here. And in the further distance, 2.5 meters. So you're only getting a very shallow of 90 centimeters of distance that it is in focus. What that creates is a more challenging situation in which you are photographing. And this is f8. And f8 is a very closed aperture, giving you a very sharp image. And that means that you can only use this kind of aperture setting in daylight or well-lit circumstances. And the challenge comes when you need to open your aperture because of lower light situations. And this is where it becomes crucial to understand the relationship of focal distance versus the aperture. Now, what we are going to do is play with the second determinant, which is the aperture. So I'm going to move the aperture to f4. And look what happened now. The focal distance is again hasn't changed, which is 2 meters, but the near focus shifted to 1.7, and the far distance, which is away from it, is only at 2 meters. So what we're having is about 30 centimeters that is in focus. So that means it's much harder to nail focus. So that means your photography skills, your skills in capturing that image accurately must be well attuned. Otherwise, you're not going to get something that is in focus. So what I'm going to do is move the aperture to even smaller number, which is f2. Now look what happened. You only have 20 centimeters of in focus area. So you're having 1.7 to 1.9. And that means you're only getting 20 centimeters of in focus area. And that is a very small number. Now, the aperture setting that you are going to use is going to determine a lot of what you are getting in focus. But you also want to notice something that's beautiful that happens. Anything past the person is going to have a beautiful bokeh, and the things that are in front are gonna have things that are out of focus. So in a way, you're isolating the subject matter, and this is something that a lot of people miss and not understand why it is so crucial and so important to set your aperture at a small number like the f2 or f2.8 when you are using your camera. Now, what is interesting is now people might say it's so hard to nail somebody's focus when the subject is moving and you're trying to photograph it and you put your focal distance at 2 meters and the aperture f2. Well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to move the focal length from 50 centimeters to 20 centimeters. What has happened is our numbers changed. You see the depth of near focus is 1.5 and the far away is 2.2, which means you're getting 70 centimeters of in focus area. This is probably one of the most beautiful focal lengths to use because you know that whatever you're going to photograph near is going to be in focus, and everything else beyond that is going to be out of focus. There is less chance of you making the error of not being able to use zone photography. Now, zone photography means in a lot of ways that you are using photography technique where you are attempting to capture images without having to adjust much of the setting while you are attempting to photograph. What that means is you're not trying to move the aperture setting or the focal length or any of these things when you are taking the photograph, but actually you have preset these numbers in, and all you're doing is capturing that image which is in front of you, and you have preset this number knowing that the subject matter will be in that distance. So if you are, for example, photographing on the street and you have your subject matter usually at 2 meters, you know you're going to get somebody in focus even if they are at 1.8 meters or 1.6 meters. Similarly, they could be a little bit further back at 2.1 or 2.2 meters, and you still will get a sharp image. Now, anything in front and behind that will be out of focus and giving you that beautiful bokeh. And it is for this very important reason that we must consider using our aperture at f2 or f2.8 or small number like this if we are using a wide angle lens. Otherwise, everything looks in focus. And I'll demonstrate this by moving the aperture dial to f5.6. You see what happens is now our near distance falls to 1 meter. So that means anything between 1 meter and all the way up to 10 meters is in focus. That means you're basically not going to have any issues nailing focus. And you don't need to go to f8 or f11 to ensure that your photographs are in focus if your focal length is something like 20 meters. And I'm going to move this a little bit up to 35 millimeters, and look what happened here. Now our focal in focus distance has shrunk considerably from 10 meters to 2.5 meters. So if you are using 35 millimeters, it is more challenging to get things in focus. But if your subject matter is at 2 meters in general, you're going to get 1.4 meter, which is indicated here, in focus, all the way up to 2.5 meters. And that is a beautiful range to work in because you're going to not have everyone in focus if you are, for example, photographing a crowd, which means that you're going to be isolating the subject. And that's something I truly like with using this kind of zone metering system. Now, I will demonstrate how this can be applied using Leica lenses in my next tutorial, which I will indicate how each of these settings are applied on the lens itself, so you don't have to go to this chart. But this chart, what I recommend to you is download this kind of application. There are tens and tens of these types of applications on smartphones and various applications, and that you can look at these numbers. And after a while, if you have used these numbers efficiently, it becomes second nature to know that if you set your focal length at 35 millimeters at 5.6, that you are going to get everything from 1.4 meter all the way to 2.5 meters in focus. So that is only a reference that we use. And secondly, I will tell you this: if you are using the metering system that is indicated on the barrel of the lens, like in the Leica lenses and some other lenses, that you will see that those numbers are not precise and accurate as this is, because this is very accurate. It doesn't say 1.4 meters, for example, of things that are in focus on the Leica lens. It just indicates it with a bar, and you are supposed to know that within those two bars is what your focus is going to be, that is going to be in focus. Outside those numbers, you're going to see that those are not in focus areas. So that is something that we use and something that we apply time and time again in our photography techniques. Also, something else very important: a lot of people think that they must nail the focus every time, and that's why they have to use autofocus systems. Autofocus systems are wonderful, especially if you are doing a number like f1.4, f2 in low light circumstances. That is the time when you need it the most, because what happens is your depth of field is going to be very, very shallow. And times our eyes are not well attuned to capturing things in focus unless we enlarge it or we'll see it in larger scale to know that the image is in focus. And it is for that very reason automatic cameras function very well when you're doing this kind of photography with very, very small apertures. Now, speaking of that, like for example, a lens like Leica Noctilux at 0.95, it's virtually impossible to nail anything in focus, even if you have predetermined the distance, because that means it's a very, very wide open aperture, and your shallow depth of field is going to be so small that it's almost impossible to capture an image in focus. And if that is your attempt, of course, you could have a motion blur, which will give an indication of movement, and that's a totally different form of photography, an artistic expression. But what I'm talking about is getting it in focus. So using a 0.95 or Simulux at 1.4 is extremely difficult, especially with longer focal lengths. As I indicated here, if you move the focal length higher and longer numbers, it's going to give you situations where it's going to be harder to focus and harder to get that focus right. So if you're going to invest in that Simulux, make sure your photography skills are up to date and you are able to use those focal lengths and focal settings correctly, and your aperture at wide open, because that's what you're paying for. You can get a Summicron at f2 and know that the Summicron is going to perform just as well at 5.6 as a Simulux, or perhaps even better, but you are using the light gathering capabilities of a Simulux at f1.4, and it's only a stop smaller than the Summicron, and it is because you want to be able to use your camera to be able to capture those images in sharp focus. Now, getting back to that number, I'm going to do something very interesting. I'm going to move the focal length to 135 millimeters. Notice this is very important, because when you move your focal length to 135 millimeter, which Leica produces at f3.4, they used to produce it at f2.8, but they stopped that production for various profitable reasons, I believe, but that's besides the context of this story. What we want to do is look at these numbers now. What happened is we have a very, very, very narrow depth of field, which is indicated at 0.1. That is 10 centimeters, very, very small. But this is what we are doing here is we are using a telephoto lens, and that means is everything in the background becomes out of focus, and that means that you're going to get these amazing bokehs, nicely blurred out shots, so much more than what you will get if you're using a wide angle lens. And it is for this reason that we want to use these longer focal lengths, especially in portrait photography, because it helps to isolate the subject better. Now, there is a big misconception about photography, and that is street photography does not mean that you are going to use wide angle lenses. I repeat that again. Street photography does not mean that you must use wide angle lenses. And it is for this very reason that people have not attempted to use 85 millimeter or 75 millimeter or 90 millimeter or 135 millimeter for street photography. Yet they give so much more in beauty and perspective when you're using it for street photography. There is no law that says you cannot use it. It just means that it's harder to use it, because notice at 5.6 your shallow depth of field is so much that you have to be very, very sure that you can nail that focus. So what I will do is, for example, at a situation like this is, I want me to try and photograph somebody at 2 meters. I'll try to photograph somebody at 10 meters, because that's what it gives me. It gives me that long distance. And look what happened now. You're getting 9.1 meters to 11 meters. So that's 2 meters of distance in which the person can be in focus. Now, this is very similar to the number that we had when we were using a wide angle lens, which at setting of, for example, 2 meters, we had a longer distance. And this is giving us the opportunity to nail focus more comfortably without having to worry about having the subject matter out of focus. And notice again here, the distance in front and behind the subject matter are out of focus, giving it a beautiful rendition of bokeh. And this is the reason it is very, very important to understand the focal length changes that affect how the image is composed. And a lot of people make the mistake of believing that the only way to photograph street photography is to use a wide angle lens. You could be far away and be taking photographs. That means that you are not going to be as pressured to take that photograph because somebody's watching or that somebody's reacting to you taking photographs. You could be on the other side of the street taking that photograph, which gives you that leverage of being able to capture the photographs in their nature, in their beautiful space, without having the outside person, the photographer, influencing the photograph. Your presence will not affect the way the photograph is. And this is something very beautiful to understand. Also, it helps you to notice that the image that you have captured is beautifully blurred in the places where you do not want things to be in focus. And another important thing is that when your focal length grows longer and longer, you are actually narrowing the space and you're squeezing things together. That means is you're getting more into your frame as you move away. Now, we think of the opposite. We think, oh, wide angle lens captures a wider distance, a wider spectrum. Yes, because you are having a wide angle. But when you narrow it and you move further away, you are actually squishing all that information into a smaller space as you move further and further back. So that means you say you are taking a photograph of someone, a group of people. As you move back further and further, you're putting those people closer, more knit together. And that is why in film, for example, when you see these walking shots on, let's say, New York streets, and there seems to be a lot of people, and this is how they create it, is they use long focal lengths, because that will give the intention of being a very crowded space. You could have taken that with a wide angle lens. What would have happened is that you'll begin to notice that the subject matters within the frame are moving further and further apart. It doesn't give that close-knit look. Now, this is something very important to consider, and it is for this very reason it is fundamentally important to understand the focal lengths and the aperture settings. And a lot of people miss this, and this is very, very important. And this is why I always say, take a workshop. Whether it's you come to my workshop, you go to somebody else's workshop, take a workshop. And that doesn't mean photography class. Photography class is different. Photography class, they tell you and make you do assignments, and they don't go into this detail. You want a lot of information compacted into a short period of time where you are able to take that information, apply it right away, and get results, not have a week of, between your work and your class, because that in that time you lose that space of intensity, and then you lose the details and information, because we tend to forget things. But when things are compacted into a short period of time in a workshop setting, then you are able to do a lot of other things, which is to attain that information and use it right away. Now, I'm going to do something else here, which is something important to notice. We are going to reduce the focal length back to right here, 50 meters. Okay, and what we're going to do, 50 meters is a wonderful focal length for photography, because it is what our eyes are usually seeing when we look at some space in front of us. And usually they say it's between 40 to 50 meters. Number is never correct, but that is what we see in front of us. And what happens is when we look at something at 5.6 and the subject is 10 meters away, we get a lot of things in focus. And this is something that is very, very important. You want to use shorter and shorter focal lengths as the subject matter moves in closer. So at 10 meters, we're getting so much in focus, which is 30 meters in depth of focus, and that's not what we want to have depth of field. We want to use this probably at 50 millimeters at something like 5 meters. And watch what happens. You have this beautiful comfortable range, 3.6 meters to 7.8. You have almost more than 4 meters that is in focus, giving you that opportunity to nail everything beautifully and yet still have things that are in the bokeh part. And as again, this is good for beautifully lit situations. It's good for street photography. It's good for situations in daytime, and you could even use it when the background is further away from the subject matter. So if you are, for example, taking somebody's portraiture in a field, the field is going to look out of focus and have a beautiful bokeh. But if you are on the street and taking a photograph, you notice that if the subject matter is at 2 meters, you're going to get all the walls behind him or all the things behind him in focus. So what we're going to do is we're going to even narrow this down to like about 2 meters again. And what happens again here is that it's 1.7 to 2.3 meters. You have 60 centimeters of space that should be in focus. So for example, you have some people in front, you have some people in the back, and your subject matter is in the middle. This is when you use it, and this is how you can compose an image that is beautiful and distinctly unique. That means you have put attention into framing this photograph. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that if they nail that focus, if they nail that photograph accurately and everything is in perfect focus, that it will look good. No, it doesn't. No, it does not look good. Most of the time, majority of the times. What is important is to notice that if you use your camera and lens settings accurately, then you are able to highlight subject matters within your frame. And that is what is important. And it is very important to understand what our eye searches for when we look at an image. Our eyes don't want to go to the out of focus area. It wants to go to the in focus area. And that is our aim, that to draw the attention to that part of the frame that we want things to be in focus. Now, in our next review, I'm going to demonstrate it with photographs of how this does affect our images. And this is going to give us a working boundary which we can operate. And also I will show you on the lens itself how I use these settings accurately to capture images. And I hope this has been an informative review. I hope this is giving you an understanding of how zone photography works. I looked on the internet, I looked at a lot of the YouTube videos, and I haven't seen things that tell you exactly how zone photography can be applied. They explain the theory, but there is not enough in-depth knowledge or explanation about using this type of photography techniques. And it is for this very reason I wanted to emphasize this point and explain how I see photography and how I apply these techniques into photography. And that I hope will improve your photography techniques. Now, I would appreciate it if you like this video to like the video itself and subscribe to our channel. You can also make a small donation. There's a link in below. And the lenses that I prefer to use for street photography, I've listed some of them in the description section below. You can look at the links that will take you to those pages that have the best prices. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the description section below and the comment section below, and I will answer them as best as I can. And you are also invited to visit our newly established forum called leicaforum.com. And I'll see you in our next review. Thank you.